Hi, I'm Stephen Tallamy, and in this video I want to continue my exploration of 80s and 90s rack mount synthesizers with the Yamaha TX81Z. Now, whilst Korg and Roland were focused on PCM sample-based synthesis, Yamaha was continuing its reign of FM-based synthesizers. Probably the most well-known of the Yamaha FM synthesizers is the DX7, and the TX81Z is a few generations after that and also in a rack-mounted form. So before we take a look at the synth itself, I thought it would be useful just to take a look at the principles behind FM. So if you already know about FM synthesis, then feel free to skip over this, but I think it might just be useful, particularly to look at how FM affects different types of wave shapes. So your classic FM synthesizer is usually a sine wave, and then it is being modified by other sine waves. So what I've got here up in Reactor is a simple oscillator. So I'm going to just wire in the sine wave. And you can see we've got a tone here that is being created, a very simple tone, because sine waves are very, very simple. There aren't any harmonics to them. And this is why FM synthesis often uses sine waves, because what you're trying to do is take that sine wave and add harmonics to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this second oscillator and use it to vary the pitch of the first oscillator. Now I've put a VCA in the middle of this just so I can change the amount to which it's going to affect the pitch. So if I just wire this up to start with, because we've got the VCA down to 0, we've got no effect at all. Now you'll see here I've got this set to a very, very low, a very slow pitch. So if we slowly bring up the VCA, you'll see that it is just very gently modifying the pitch backwards and forwards. Now obviously if I bring up that level, the amount that it is operating on the pitch, then we can get some pretty big sweepy sounds. But the other thing that we can do is take the frequency and modify that. So let's just start bringing the frequency up from effectively what's an LFO up into an audio rate. So this is maybe a vibrato. And as we start getting into audio rates, watch what happens to that signal. It really fattens out. And then we start to see some harmonics forming. So because these pitches are actually matching, you can see there are some harmonics that have been created here. If I add this signal a little bit more heavily to the pitch modification, you'll see those get bigger. Those harmonics are getting bigger and bigger, and then the pitch starts to change. So we start to change pitch and go almost atonal. Then this bass frequency is building up. And then again, if we find the right sweet spot, you can see that we're actually getting a tonal sound, and then we go atonal again. We quickly get into Doctor Who territory. So one of the interesting things about the TX81Z is that it doesn't just use sine waves, it also has triangle waves and other styles of waveforms, which some of the early FM synthesizers didn't have. They only dealt with sine waves, and this creates a very different effect. So let's take a triangle wave. And what we see with FM turned off, so we've got nothing going through the VCA, is that the triangle wave already has a lot of harmonics. And so if we start bringing this again, if we're in the LFO range, so very low frequency, all of those harmonics move together. And so now when we start to modify the frequency again, all of the harmonics are going to be impacted by the incoming signal. And again, when we hit the right balance between the frequency and the level and the oscillator over here, we get some really fat bassy sounds. And one of the interesting things is that you can have different oscillator types both on the carrier, so the thing you're actually hearing, and the modifier oscillator. So let's go back to a sine wave. And now let's try and modify it with a triangle wave. That's a very different type of sound than if we had the sine wave modifying it. So let's compare that with the sine wave. And again, if we go for a saw wave, very different again. So it's that combination. If we take that triangle wave and then use it to modify a triangle wave, again, a very different tone. So now you get the idea of what FM synthesis does. You can imagine the sort of sounds that an FM synthesizer is really going to sound well is those that are rich in harmonics, and typically that's things that are quite metallic sounding, like electric pianos or bells. So let's have a listen to some of the sounds that you might get on the TX1Z. So here's one of the sort of classic electric pianos. So here's a slightly richer kind of EP sound. Now these are the sounds right out of the synth, so I haven't added any effects on top of it. Typically you would add something like reverb, maybe a bit of chorus to these sounds, and that's certainly how it would have been used in most productions. So let's try a Celeste type of sound. Now that's definitely calling out for some delay sounds. Let's add a bit of delay to it. So probably one of the most famous sounds on this module, and probably one that people would just buy this module just for this one sound, is the lately bass. Really good bass that cuts through in the mix and was very, very popular in dance music in the 90s. But there are other bassy sounds, obviously, slightly more interesting. So this is a 4-operator FN synthesizer, which basically means it's got 4 oscillators that you can choose how you want to wire them together. So they can all go out in parallel, or they can be performing FM on each other. Now, if you send all of them out in parallel, then you're going to get something more of an organ sound like this. Now, as per some of the other modules that I've reviewed, I found a few other patches that have been made more recently, and these ones come from LFO Store. So here's NK Drops. Again, another good one for some delay. So these LFO Store patches were really designed to bring out more of the warmth of it. So whilst these can still be quite nice metallic sounds, they're a bit more on the softer side, a bit less edgy. So this patch is obviously inspired by the CS80, so a bit of brass sounds. And one more just from this set, NK Drone. So as I've done with some of my other videos, I thought it would be useful to take a look at how you might integrate this into a modern DAW or modern computer-based workstation. So here's quite a useful editor that I found. It's under controller and you can download it. It's the Yamaha TX81Z. I'll put a link below. And here you can control the various operators. So you can see there's the 4 different operators with the different waveforms. And you can change the various parts of it. So if you see here, I just changed the frequency here, and it's changing the frequency ratios within the synth. So pretty nice. Let's go back to that lately bass. We can then mess about with some of the parameters quite easily here using this interface. So if we take this original sound and change maybe the frequency of operator 2, so you can see, really, depending on what frequency you pick, you're going to get a very different sound. You can also mess about with the levels. So for a softer sound, you can pull down operator 2 and make it a bit louder. You can really crank it up. Now, one of the things you have to be careful with is that these are all sending system exclusive messages, and this doesn't really have a very large bus for system exclusive. So you can very quickly, if you move things too fast on the interface, you can very quickly end up getting this MIDI buffer full error. And well, the only way you can get away from that is to go back to the patch edit. So that's a little bit frustrating. You do have to be a little bit careful when changing the values of these parameters on the fly. Now, having a look at this maybe from a Logic point of view, very easy to change the messages here inside of Logic, just basically standard program messages. Now, to set all this up, you need to open up the MIDI environment. Now, it seems that in the latest versions of Logic, that MIDI environment isn't something that's even available in this Windows. I think they've deprecated it, which is a shame. I'm not quite sure how you're going to be able to set all this kind of stuff up in any future versions of Logic. But if you hold down the Option key, then you'll see Open MIDI Environment, or you can just remember the shortcut Command O, and that brings you back to the MIDI environment. And what you'll see here is I've actually set up a MIDI instrument here. So just adding a regular new MIDI instrument, and you can come in here, double click on it, and you can load in your patch names. Now, there's quite a strange thing with the TX81Z is that it has no bank messages. So if you watch my JV1080 or my Korg or any of those videos, you'll see that I mess about with bank messages. There is only effectively one bank, even though it sort of says there are different, banks in it. There's only actually one set of program messages. So you can only change 128 messages at once, and there's actually A, B, C, D and I, so that's 5 times 32 patches, so that's more than 128. So it's a bit of a strange environment, but by default it will do the I patches at the beginning, and then it will then have the A patches, the B patches, and then the C patches, and the D patches you kind of just can't get access to unless you go and dig deeper into the interface. So it's a bit of a strange limitation of it. So similar to what I've done previously in other videos, I also wanted to see, could I change some of the parameters of a patch using controls inside of Logic. So you can see here I've set up these various faders, so just coming in here and creating a regular fader, and again, these are system exclusive ones, so you really need to be ready to mess about with system exclusive messages. This is the particular message. A little bit hard to see here. I usually would view my system exclusive in hex, so you can see F43, 10 and various other things. This is the kind of setup for each of these, so each one of them is slightly different. Now, the way in which I actually figured this out was from that controller interface. If you put the controller interface into edit mode, so instead of this panel mode, you can actually see and edit each of these different parameters. So you can go in here, look at how this is set up, and someone's done all the hard work of finding out what is the system exclusive formula. So you can see here, that is the bit that's being varied by the knob. This is also an internal parameter. This is depending on what MIDI channel you're sending through out of, but this is the variable part. And so basically I use that to figure out how each of these are going to be set up. So you can see here, that is the value of the different sliders. So having done that and wired it all up, so I've got it coming out of here into these various meters. All I did at the moment is just wire up the level of each of the operators and the ratio. So the ratio is the amount of frequency compared to the note that's being played, and this can be very simple because it means that when you are wanting those nice overtones that are harmonic, you can just do a nice regular interval and that will come out and sounding quite nice. And so you can see I can move these sliders up and down, and we've got the same thing again. I've got my range to 0 to 99 because that's the maximum value each of these, but I can be now changing the various levels of the different operators, and similarly I can change the ratios. So come in here and mess around with the operator ratios here using these. Now, going one step further than this, I wanted to see, could I wire that up to an external controller, because I really wanted to see how I could modify these things in real time and see what the effect of that was. And so what you will see is I've mapped each of these to an input controller. So that's controller 12, that's controller 16, etc. And those are controllers that I've got available on my Behringer DeepMind. So each of the faders give out a control message. So what I've done is I've wired up the DeepMind so that I can control these different levels using the DeepMind. So let's just go and switch over to that now. So you can see there's lots of fun to be had here if you're willing to mess about with system exclusive messages, and it makes it a much more hands-on approach. So whilst changing the frequency and the relative level of the operators is one very immediate thing that you can be doing, there's a lot more control you can get into. One of the obvious ones is just changing the algorithm. So these say how the different operators are routed into each other. So algorithm 1 will take the output of 4, send it to 3, send that to 2, and send that to 1. But there are various other different ones that are going to give you different effects. And so it can just be fun having exactly the same patch and changing the algorithm and seeing how that sounds. In addition, because this has multiple different waveforms, playing around with the different waveforms on board, not just the sine waves, but the various different other waves that are there, can give you very interesting effects, as I showed at the very beginning of the video, where you change the modulation sources as well. Now, if you just want to play about with FM synthesis, particularly in the style of the Yamaha DX range or TX range, then Dext is a great option. It's completely free. And again, you can play about with all of the different things. This has 6 operators, so it's very close to the DX7, remembering that the TX81Z only has 4 operators, so you may not want to use all of them if you want very similar to the TX range. And you can just play about with everything here. So here's a patch. And one of the things you can really see very obviously here are that not only are the operators sending out different waveforms, but you have an envelope around the level as well, which is how you can create really interesting effects, because whilst you might be sending various signals into each other, different operators, you can also vary over time how much they are operating on each other, and that gives a lot of really interesting sound design possibilities. Also, in the world of software FM synthesizers, if you have the complete package from Native Instruments, then you often get FM8 included, which again is a really nice FM synthesizer. Let's play one of the patches from that. Again, this gives you quite a nice visualization of the different operators, the different ratios, and the way in which they feed into each other in quite a complex algorithm here. One of the cool things about this is that if you take a look at some of the names of the authors of various patches in the FM7 legacy patches, you've got people like Junkie XL, various other really big names as well. So quite a lot of really interesting, inspiring patches inside of the FM8. So would I recommend picking up one of these synths? Well, I think it's okay. It's certainly an easy way to get that classic vintage DX sound without forking out on a DX7 or one of the larger keyboard bases. And obviously if you don't have the space for it, then a rack mount can be quite desirable. Probably the biggest limitation is that controllability. The tweakability from the front panel isn't all that great, and those system exclusive buffer overflows can be really frustrating. Now, some alternatives in the world of FM that you could pick up now, maybe the Yamaha Reface DX, which is very similar in terms of it's a 4-operator FM synthesizer, or if you want to go up to 6 operators, then you could consider the Korg Op6. Do you own any of the DX or the TX81Z range of Yamaha FM synthesizers, or have been exploring other FM synths recently? Please let me know in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, then please do give it a thumbs up, share and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.